So joining me is the very brilliant, the main man I like to call him these days. It's Ariel Helwani at home in New York. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great, Gareth. How are you? It's nice to see and hear from you.
Yeah, well, it's a very, very unusual time, but I've seen that you've been very, very busy because one of your major roles, of course, covering the UFC, it's really been in the news in the last few weeks. How has that been covering that story? That obviously it's changed in the last 24, 36 hours, but, was it extraordinary that the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, was still going to have an event in spite of this kind of global pandemic and the lockdowns going on all over the place?
Yeah, it was exhausting at times. It was fascinating to cover because here in the United States, sport kind of shut down around March 11th. And so I was thinking about this last night. It feels like we got an extra month of stuff to cover. Like everything kind of shut down for the rest of the basketball and hockey, baseball guys. But we had an event on the 14th, and that was the one in Brazil, and then all this stuff about 249 and Khabib and Tony Ferguson and Justin Gaethje and the Island and all this stuff. So, I mean, I was saying this to my wife. I feel like I'm working harder now than I was back when things were normal. It was really crazy to see how it all panned out. It was crazy to see all the twists and turns, the ups and downs. But in the end, I think that sanity prevailed, and I don't think it should have gotten this far. I don't think it should have even been a question whether or not they put on UFC 249. I don't think they should have. It was not a great look for the sport, and I'm just happy it didn't actually happen. I feel for the fighters. I feel for the fact that they don't make money. I feel for the ones like Jessica Andrade who flew to Las Vegas to prepare for this fight. I feel for Ian Cutelaba who flew from Moldova. I feel for Alistair Overeem who on Wednesday flew to take a fight on May 16th, and now who knows if he's going to fight. So uh, I think at times it was a little bit ignorant, selfish, reckless. I'm just happy it's not happening because MMA and any combat sport should not be above the rest of humanity. And if the rest of humanity has to sit at home right now, from Australia to Thailand to Brazil to British Columbia, MMA fighters should stay at home as well.
Because the thing is, it was clear, as you say, from around March the 11th. I mean, I was in Connecticut at the time and had been in New York. I was at an MMA event that was called off in the 11th hour, Bellator MMA, but everything was shutting down at the time. Basketball had gone, got home to the UK, and there was a steady kind of accumulation then of, things shutting, the shutters coming down very, very slowly on everything until we got to the point where it was clear that boxing was off for a month. Boxing was off for 2 months. The British Boxing Board Control called it off. Bob Arum wanted to carry on with events behind closed doors. Eddie Hearn was really keen to, because we know how promoters are very creative characters. They have to put an event together, a venue, fighters, all those things. But for me, where I thought the UFC might pull the plug was when they were trying to get Leon Edwards to fly from Birmingham, the British fighter, to suddenly fly to fight Tyron Woodley somewhere in the United States because London had been cancelled, because we were off to do our fight night show from the London event, and it was gone. And then Leon Edwards had been asked in like 12 hours to get his team together, get to an airport, buy the tickets, get to America to go where? And he was right to say no, because common sense, which ain't common, yeah, told you, no, sit tight at the moment. Keep your resources, keep your powder dry, because logistically and logically, it takes 150 people to run an event. Basic staff, TV crews. This is made for TV sports. How can 150 people gather together when we're seeing hospitals crowded with people with COVID-19? It just does not make sense. And I actually think that going forwards, and I've spoken to the boxing authorities here and the boxing authorities around the World Boxing Council, they think that medicals that clear you of COVID-19 when you fight are probably going to be very important going forward and maybe mandatory. Do you think that will happen in MMA?
It should be, as you know, boxing and MMA play by different rules, and perhaps that's why this was able to get as far as it did with the UFC. But what made me feel so uncomfortable about it was, I don't know if you remember, back in 1997 there was an event called UFC 12. It was supposed to happen in Buffalo, New York, and a couple
Yeah.
of days before the event, the New York State Athletic Commission said, "You're not doing this. You're banned." And then they tried to move it to Oregon, and Oregon said no. And so they moved it then to Dothan, Alabama, 200 miles away from Birmingham,
They took
Alabama.
on
And
trucks, didn't they? They went on trucks.
yes, and this is what it had become. With all due respect to Tachi Palace, there's no regulation there, and the UFC found the one place that would allow them to come in. They're going to take a lot of money from them, and there's no money being brought into this casino, so I can understand why they wanted to do it. But it was nonsensical at this point. What were we doing? What were we trying to do? Like, this idea that we need entertainment. You don't need entertainment. There's a million Netflix shows that you can watch right now. There's a million movies out there. You don't need fighting right now, okay? The same way you don't need soccer, football, basketball, baseball. You don't need these things right now. And that's a very selfish point of view. And the idea that these fighters were going to descend from all over the world and they were going to tie up medical resources when there's people dying by the thousands, to me was a hard thing to come to terms with. It was a hard thing to come to grips with. This won't mean much to you, but the quote that I keep thinking about this past week. There's a very famous American football coach named Dennis Green. May he rest in peace. And several years ago, his team, the Arizona Cardinals, lost a very close game to the Chicago Bears. And at the time, the Chicago Bears were one of the best teams in the NFL. And the Cardinals were not, but they almost beat them. And at the press conference, Dennis Green shows up and says, "They were who we thought they were. They were exactly who we thought they were, and we could have beaten these guys if we left them off the hook." And you know what I think of this week? I think of MMA is what we thought it was, and we have confirmed the beliefs of so many, because so many thought that MMA over the years was cage fighting, it was barbaric, it was ruthless, all this stuff, and we had reached a point that maybe we were mainstream, and in the end, we showed our true colors, and it was disappointing to see how far it played out.
No, I agree because I'm unconventional. You're unconventional. What are we doing? We're locked down in our own homes at the moment. We live unusual lives. I bet you're desperate to go to the studio rather than homeschooling your kids at the moment, which is obviously brilliant fun as well, because I know how much you love your family. But I thought that as well. Why be the Outlaws at this time? When for years we didn't want to be the Outlaws. You and I have put the years in. I started covering this sport 15 years ago when at the Telegraph it was seen as cage fighting, dirty. I hopefully, in the way I covered it and the way I covered people, helped to change the way it was perceived as a mainstream sport with serious athletes, with people who are extraordinarily interesting. And I completely agree with you. It's like, why be the rebel at this time? And I think it's a very, very well made point. And I think I was fascinated. I didn't. I mean, I said on last week's show, I don't see it happening. The plug will be pulled on this. That was my instinct all the way through, because it was nonsensical, irresponsible, and frankly, you know, the problem is people want to be entertained, and on social media, the collective, the people have a big voice. Of course, they want to see an event. There are millions of events, or hundreds or thousands of events. I guarantee you that they haven't seen. Rerun those right now.
Mm.
There are not. I bet you there aren't more than a couple of million people out there who've seen every single major MMA event there's ever been. I've got a whole library of stuff here that I've still got to get through. I'm sure you have. You cannot watch every event. Let's rerun the greatest ever every Saturday night. Over here in the UK, they had a Conor McGregor night recently.
Yeah.
That's all. Just be creative.
Right.
Do a live video link up with Dana White and three of the fighters that would have fought on the night, and say, what are you going through tonight, guys? Mentally, what are you like? Let's do a video link for an hour with Khabib and Tony with Dana White in the middle. I'm creating an idea here now that they'll
Sure.
do. Just
Yeah.
a live show on Zoom and put it out. It'll get millions of viewers. Do you know?
I agree.
So there's loads of ways of isolating ourselves and entertaining ourselves without putting people at risk at the moment. Our sport is risky enough as it is. There's no need to cause greater risks. Let me ask you, when you were covering it in the last few weeks, and you cover it in intimate detail, did you have moments where you're thinking, I can't believe this, it is actually going to go ahead? And did you think, do I need to get down there and cover it?
So there were moments where I thought, yeah, it looks like maybe they'll be able to pull this off because of the fact that it was happening on a tribal land, and tribal lands in the United States are sovereign. However, as I've said to multiple people, there wasn't enough money on the planet to get me to go to that
Good.
event. I was not going to that event. I was not going on a plane. I was not doing it. And I saw some of my colleagues, I was talking to them, they're like, oh, we have to cover it to make sure it's on the up and up. Not during a pandemic, my man. We're not doing the Lord's work by covering MMA. Like, don't kid yourselves here. We're still in the toy department, as Howard Cosell once said. We're in the toy department of the newsroom. You're not doing, like I said, the Lord's work by covering mixed martial arts to make sure the UFC is on the up and up. No, thanks. I want to be healthy for my kids and my wife. So I'll cover it from home. Absolutely. And it's not like I'm trying to take a moral stance by boycotting it. I'm still covering it, talking about it 24/7. I just don't feel comfortable. I went to UFC 248 in Las Vegas, Israel Adesanya and Yoel Romero. And in hindsight, probably wasn't very smart in the midst of that March 8th, March 7th. And so I never considered, it never got to that point. No one asked me to go, but I would have felt very uncomfortable going.
Well, I mean, I know exactly what you mean, because when I was at the Bellator Connecticut event, and that was called off 4 hours before it was due to. First of all, it was with an audience. Then it was behind closed doors. And luckily enough, because I was doing a little segment on the TV back to Sky Sports in the UK, I was able to get a pass. I was actually very relieved myself when it was called off 4 hours before, because I thought, oh, this is the right thing to do. And I think until you've been there in that place and you're actually contemplating going in, and you're seeing the Trump address and flights being cancelled and people in hospital in Italy and people in hospital in Wuhan, until you get to that moment, you don't actually think, like, for example, when there are all these conspiracy theories out there at the moment, and people are saying, but yeah, is it governments trying to control people? All the conspiracy theories are coming out. I want to see those conspiracy theorists going reporting from a hospital. That's what I want to see. That's what I want to see. Because maybe some people who are dying are not all dying of COVID, and there is other flus and all those kind of, but this is a thing to take seriously. And if you are an instinctive person, if you're instinctual, you do want to question things. But right now, we haven't experienced a world war. If there was no sport during the World War, because there was such a serious issue, the rising tide of fascism, of nationalist socialism, that it needed dealing with. It was a pandemic of its own. I don't want to go into all of that right now, but there are bigger things than us.
Yes.
There are bigger things to fight than a fight in a steel cage on a Saturday night. That's it.
I know, and I felt like sometimes I was living in a bizarro world, because the fans are very vocal, and I can understand, and sometimes we put too much stock into Twitter and things like that. You read 15 messages and you're like, oh, everyone's against me, but it's 15 people if we put it all into perspective, and who are these people, and what are they all about? But it was just kind of ugly, especially on Thursday night when it finally broke that the fight wasn't going to happen. I saw media bickering with fans and managers blaming the media and fighters, and it's just, I was like, I want nothing to do with this. You know what? For once, I'm just going to put the phone away and walk away from it all. So I didn't really weigh in all that much. I put out the news, and that was that. And it just, I love MMA, and I've devoted my my adult life to covering it, right? And I love the fighters dearly, and I've had such great experiences covering this sport. This just wasn't a good week for the sport. And hopefully, when this all resumes, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, God willing, sooner rather than later, we can forget about all this and go back to, the upward trajectory that the sport was on in terms of gaining mainstream acceptance. Because this was a step back, in my opinion.
Final thing, and I'm asking everyone this at the moment: what you got in your fridge?
What's funny about that? So we just got a delivery last night. So one of the ways that I was able to almost block everything out, it arrived at 8:30, 45 or so p.m. Eastern time. So this story broke around 6 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday, excuse me. And I got the delivery, and then I spent 3 hours, Gareth, wiping it all down with Clorox wipes, and I
Yeah.
was freaking exhausted afterwards. So from 9 to midnight, that's what I was doing. I was wiping down while my family was sleeping, wiping down every single cereal box, every fruit, vegetable, whatever can for 3 hours. So at the moment, I've got a lot in my fridge because I just got it. But with three little kids, it's going to go pretty fast.
Lovely, lovely. Listen, it's absolutely fabulous to see you, to hear you, and we will see you on the other side. Yeah, we'll see you on the other.
Amen. I look forward to that day, and keep well, and I hope that everyone all over the world just stays home and stays smart and stays safe and healthy, because the more stringent we are, the sooner life resumes, and that's the most important thing. It's not about trying